Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, April 1987. Dorothy Grace Brennan woke at 3 in the morning to screaming. Not the usual elderly groans she had grown accustomed to during the 4 years she had shared a home with her father-in-law, but screaming filled with such raw animal terror that the hair on the back of her neck stood up. The 26-year-old high school English teacher sat in the darkness of her bedroom, listening to something crash behind the wall, and the voice of Walter Calhoun hoarsely shouting the same words over and over. "Do not! Please do not! Please do not!" Her husband Raymond slept beside her like the dead. After a night shift at the steel mill, even an air raid would not wake him. Dorothy pulled on her bathrobe and stepped into the hallway. The door to her father-in-law's room stood ajar, dim light from a nightlight spilling out. She peered inside. 60-year-old Walter Eugene sat on his bed, head in his hands, drenched in sweat. His pajamas clung to his bony back. He rocked forward and backward like a praying Orthodox Jew, muttering something unintelligible. "Pop, what is wrong?" Dorothy approached cautiously, touching his shoulder. The old man flinched so violently she jerked back. He raised his eyes to her, empty, unseeing, filled with such bottomless darkness that her palms went cold. "They were not supposed to scream," he whispered. "I told them, do not scream, and it will be quick." Dorothy froze. Her father, the late Gregory Michael Brennan, had been a history professor specializing in World War II. She had grown up surrounded by his books, his stories about the war, and she recognized this look from photographs in archived criminal case files. The look of a man who had done something irreversible. "Pop, you had a nightmare," she said quietly. "Go back to sleep." Walter Eugene blinked and his gaze cleared. He looked at her differently now, with his usual grandfatherly warmth. "Dorothy? Sorry, sweetheart. Getting old, bad dreams." He smiled a guilty, toothless smile. "Go back to bed, do not worry." But Dorothy could not sleep until morning. She lay in the darkness, replaying all her father-in-law's war stories. There were many. Walter Eugene was a local celebrity, veteran of the Office of Strategic Services, recipient of the Bronze Star, honorary citizen of Greenfield Township. At every holiday, they seated him at the head table. High school students came to record his memories. The local newspaper regularly printed his interviews. Dorothy had heard these stories hundreds of times. About how in 1942, 16-year-old Walter Calhoun had lied about his age and enlisted. How he had been recruited into the OSS for operations behind enemy lines in France. How they had sabotaged Nazi supply lines and liberated French villages from collaborators. How in 1943 he had been wounded by shrapnel in the leg and spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, nursed back to health by a French resistance medic named Marcel. Most of the stories were alive, natural. Details changed. Sometimes the shrapnel hit his left leg, sometimes his right. Sometimes the supply convoy was heading to Paris, sometimes to Lyon. This was normal. That is how human memory works. But there was one story he always told the same way, word for word, to the last comma. The story about how they liberated the village of Saint-Rémy in September 1943. "We came at dawn," Walter Eugene would invariably begin, staring somewhere past his listeners' heads. Fog was so thick you could not see 5 yards ahead. The captain said, "Boys, we are going in quiet." We approached from 3 directions. The collaborationist militia headquarters was at the village entrance, in the old schoolhouse. 17 Vichy militia and 4 German soldiers. We took out the sentry with a knife. That was done by Frank Kowalski, God rest his soul. Then we burst inside. Fighting broke out. 2 of ours died, James Patterson and Peter Sullivan. But we took the building. 17 collaborators, shot them all for treason. 4 Germans taken prisoner, later sent to command. We liberated the village. The people cried, kissed our hands, always that way. Word for word, and always 17 militia, 4 Germans, 2 dead OSS men. Fog. Dawn. Schoolhouse. Dorothy lay until morning with her eyes open. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The next day, she went to the Carnegie Library. The head librarian, Helen Morrison, greeted her warmly. "Dorothy, what can I help you find?" "I need literature on OSS operations in France during the war," Dorothy said. She was a teacher. The request seemed natural, preparing for lessons. Helen brought 3 books. One was titled Behind Enemy Lines, OSS Operations in Occupied France, 1942 to 1944. Dorothy opened it with trembling hands. Index of names. Calhoun, Walter Eugene, pages 247, 303. She found page 247. There was a photograph of an OSS unit taken in spring 1944. 3 rows of men in military uniforms and berets, holding rifles. Caption: OSS Detachment Charlie, May 1944, after liberation of Chateau Renard. In the 3rd row, 4th from left, stood a man who looked remarkably like young Walter Eugene. High forehead, prominent nose, heavy jaw. Dorothy stared at the grainy image. Similar, but was it definitely him? She turned the page. From the Memoirs of Walter Eugene Calhoun, OSS Operative. And then, text she knew by heart. The story about Saint-Rémy. Fog. 17 militia. 4 Germans. James Patterson and Peter Sullivan. Word for word. Dorothy slowly closed the book. Her hands were shaking. Why is this story printed exactly as he tells it? Because he told it many times, and they recorded it and published it, she thought. That makes sense. But why then are other stories alive, changing, while this one is dead, frozen? Because this is not a memory. This is a legend. That evening at dinner, Walter Eugene was in excellent spirits. He played with 4-year-old grandson Kenny, told jokes, laughed. The nightmare seemed forgotten. But Dorothy watched him with different eyes. She saw how he hugged Kenny, how he kissed the top of his head, how he said, "Grandpa loves you, little man." And she saw the man who had screamed in the night. I told them, do not scream. Who had he told? And why would they have screamed? "Pop," she said casually, ladling beef stew into bowls. "Tell us again about Saint-Rémy. Kenny needs it for school." Walter Eugene beamed. He loved to tell stories. It was in September of 43 he began, and Dorothy listened, counting the words silently. The fog was so thick. Word for word, not a single deviation. Where exactly in Saint-Rémy was that schoolhouse? Dorothy asked. Walter Eugene hesitated for a moment. At the entrance, he said, coming from the main road. What was the street name? Cannot remember now, sweetheart. It has been 40 years. This was strange. Other details he remembered vividly. Names of hamlets, names of fallen comrades, nicknames of commanders. But the street where the main battle of his life occurred, he did not remember. What happened to those 4 Germans you took prisoner? Another pause. Sent them to command, like I said. And after that? Do not know. I got wounded a week later, ended up in the hospital. Dorothy nodded and asked no more questions. But in her mind, a picture was forming. A picture that terrified her. The next morning, while Raymond was at work and Kenny at daycare, Dorothy took the train into downtown Pittsburgh. The Allegheny County Courthouse had a law library open to the public. She needed to understand what she was dealing with. What statute of limitations, if any, applied to war crimes? The clerk, an elderly man named Arthur, helped her find the relevant volumes. Doing research? He asked kindly. For a school project, Dorothy lied. She sat at a wooden table surrounded by legal books and read. The Nuremberg trials. The concept of crimes against humanity. The legal precedent that certain acts, genocide, mass murder, systematic atrocities, had no statute of limitations. Ever. The United States had signed international agreements, had established military tribunals, had prosecuted American soldiers for war crimes in Vietnam. The law was clear. If Walter Eugene Calhoun had committed a war crime in 1943, he could still be prosecuted in 1987, if there was evidence, if there were witnesses, if someone reported it. Dorothy sat very still. Her father-in-law could go to prison. An old man, a decorated veteran, beloved by the community, the grandfather of her child. Could she do that to her family? To Kenny, who adored his grandpa? To Raymond, who worshipped his father? She closed the books and went home. But she could not stop thinking. That night, Walter Eugene had another nightmare. This time, Dorothy did not go to his room. She lay in the dark, listening to him scream, and felt like a coward. Over the next weeks, Dorothy became obsessed. She went to the library every day, read everything about the OSS, about operations in France, about war crimes trials. She learned that in the chaos of liberation, many atrocities had been committed, by both sides. Collaborators shot without trial, German prisoners executed, civilians caught in crossfire. Some were legitimate military actions, some were murder. The question was, which was which? She took meticulous notes, read accounts from other OSS operations, studied the protocols for prisoner handling, rules of engagement, proper documentation of casualties. She discovered that the OSS had been, in theory, a highly professional organization. Operatives received training in international law, the Geneva Conventions, proper conduct in occupied territories. They were supposed to distinguish between combatants and civilians, supposed to take prisoners when possible, supposed to document every operation with detailed after-action reports. But she also discovered the reality. Young men, barely out of their teens, sent behind enemy lines with weapons and authority. Operating in a moral gray zone where the normal rules did not apply, where the enemy wore civilian clothes, where collaborators looked like neighbors, shopkeepers, farmers, where fear and adrenaline made split-second decisions that could not be taken back, where the official reports often sanitized what really happened. Dorothy read a memoir by an OSS officer who had served in Italy. He described an operation where they had raided a fascist headquarters and found a woman inside, the wife of the local fascist leader, cooking dinner. One of the younger operatives had panicked and shot her. The official report listed her as enemy combatant killed in action. The officer wrote, "We knew it was wrong. But what were we supposed to do? Court-martial a 19-year-old kid for making a mistake in combat? Destroy his life? We told ourselves it was war, that these things happened, that we had to protect our own. So we lied. And I have lived with that lie for 20 years. Dorothy closed the book and stared at the wall. Was that what had happened in Saint-Remy? A mistake compounded by a lie? Or had it been something worse, a deliberate execution covered up by men who knew exactly what they were doing? She needed more information, real information, not just her father-in-law's frozen narrative. She wrote a letter to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., requested records related to OSS Detachment Charlie, operations in September 1943, village of Saint-Remy, France. Signed it as Dr. Dorothy Brennan, historical researcher. It was not exactly a lie. She had a master's degree in literature and taught history electives. The response came 3 weeks later, a thick envelope with photocopied documents. Dorothy opened it with shaking hands. After-action reports, personnel lists, casualty records, and one document that made her blood run cold. A field report dated September 18, 1943, written by Captain Lawrence Henderson, commanding officer of Detachment Charlie. Subject: Operation at Saint-Remy. She read it slowly, carefully, her heart pounding. At 0600 hours, unit approached target building, former schoolhouse serving as militia headquarters. Resistance encountered. Firefight ensued. Building secured by 0645 hours. Enemy casualties, 21 killed in action. Friendly casualties, 2 killed in action. Private James Patterson, Sergeant Peter Sullivan. 4 German soldiers surrendered and were taken into custody for interrogation. Investigation ongoing regarding civilian casualties. Civilian casualties. The report did not mention 17 militia. It mentioned 21 killed. That was 4 more than Walter Eugene's story. And it mentioned an investigation. Civilian casualties. Dorothy's hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the paper. She read further. There was an attached memo dated September 25, 1943. From the Judge Advocate General's office. Subject: Investigation into Saint-Remy incident. Preliminary investigation indicates possible irregularities in the conduct of Operation Saint-Remy. Local French authorities report that among the deceased were 4 civilians, 3 women and 1 male minor, age approximately 14. Witnesses state these individuals were present in the building at the time of assault and may have been killed during or after the engagement. Further investigation required. Recommend interviewing unit personnel. And then, a final memo dated October 10, 1943. Investigation suspended due to operational priorities. Captain Henderson's unit redeployed to classified location. Matter to be revisited post-war if deemed necessary. Post-war. It had never been revisited. The investigation had been buried. 4 civilians, 3 women and a boy. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, the documents spread before her, and felt physically sick. She knew in her gut what had happened. The OSS unit had raided the building. A firefight had broken out. And when the smoke cleared, there were not just militia and Germans lying dead. There were also people who should not have been there. Collaborators' wives, perhaps. A teenage son. Collateral damage. Or something worse. Had they been killed in the crossfire? Or after the fighting stopped? And why did Walter Eugene's story mention exactly 17 militia, when the official report said 21 dead, including 4 civilians? Because he was hiding those 4. Because they haunted him. Because for 44 years he had been telling a sanitized version. A legend. A lie. Dorothy sat in that kitchen for hours. Kenny came home from daycare, and she fed him dinner mechanically, barely aware of what she was doing. Raymond came home from the mill, covered in soot and sweat, and asked what was for dinner. She heated up leftovers, did not speak. That night she lay awake again, wrestling with an impossible question. What do you do when you discover your family member, a man you have lived with for 4 years, a man your child loves, might be guilty of a war crime committed 44 years ago? Do you report it? To whom? The local police would laugh at her. The FBI? The Department of Justice? And even if they took her seriously, what then? A trial? Prison for an old man? Her husband would never forgive her. Her marriage would be over. Her son would grow up knowing his mother destroyed his grandfather. Or do you stay silent? Pretend you never found the documents? Let the old man die in peace? Let the legend live on? 3 women and a boy, dead. Maybe killed accidentally. Maybe murdered. And no one ever punished. No one ever held accountable. Because it was war. Because it was chaos. Because it was easier to forget. Dorothy got out of bed, went to the closet, pulled down the box where she kept her father's things, his books, his notes, his photographs from when he had served as a military historian at the Nuremberg trials. She found what she was looking for. A letter her father had written to her when she was 16, shortly before he died. She had read it once at his funeral, then put it away. Now she read it again. Dorothy, my dear girl, By the time you read this, I will be gone. I want to tell you something important. In my work, I have seen the worst of humanity. The things people do to each other when they think no one is watching, when they think history will not remember. And I have learned one thing. Silence is complicity. When good people stay silent, evil prevails. Not because evil is strong, but because good is cowardly. I do not know what challenges you will face in life, but I know this. When you are faced with a choice between comfort and truth, choose truth. It will cost you. Truth always costs. But silence costs more. It costs your soul. I love you. Be brave. Dad. Dorothy folded the letter carefully, put it back in the box, went back to bed, lay in the darkness beside her sleeping husband, and made her decision. The next morning, she called the Department of Justice, Office of Special Investigations. The secretary who answered sounded skeptical. "Ma'am, we handle Nazi war criminals, not American veterans." "I understand," Dorothy said calmly, "but I have documentation suggesting an American serviceman may have participated in the unlawful killing of civilians during World War II. I believe that falls under your jurisdiction." A pause. "Hold, please." 5 minutes later, a different voice. Male, older, authoritative. "This is Deputy Director Martin Kowalczyk. What exactly do you have?" Dorothy told him. Everything. The nightmares, the repeated story, the archival documents, the civilian casualties, the suspended investigation. Kowalczyk listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Can you send me copies of those documents?" "Yes." "And you are willing to make a formal statement?" "Yes." "Ma'am, I need to be clear with you. This is 44 years old. Witnesses may be dead or unreachable. Evidence may be lost. Even if we investigate, we may not be able to prosecute. And if we do prosecute, your family will be destroyed. The media will swarm. Your father-in-law will be vilified. Your husband will hate you. Your child will suffer. Are you prepared for that?" Dorothy closed her eyes, saw Kenny playing with his grandpa, saw Raymond kissing her goodbye before work, saw the life she had built, and saw 3 women and a boy lying dead in a French schoolhouse. "Yes," she said quietly, "I am prepared." The investigation took 8 months. OSI investigators flew to Pittsburgh, interviewed Dorothy, examined the documents. They tracked down the surviving members of Detachment Charlie. Most were dead. Cancer, heart disease, old age. But 3 were alive. Captain Lawrence Henderson, now 70, living in a nursing home in Florida. Eugene Marks, 58, in Oregon. Harold Deutsch, 56, in Texas. The investigators interviewed them separately. Henderson's memory was fragmented. Dementia. He remembered the operation, but not the details. Said there had been complications. Could not or would not elaborate. Marks refused to talk. Told the investigators to leave him alone. Said the war was over, ancient history, none of their damn business. Deutsch talked. He was a devout Catholic, haunted by his past. He had been seeing a priest for 40 years, trying to make peace with what he had done. He told the investigators everything. The unit had raided the schoolhouse at dawn. Fighting had broken out. They had killed the militia guards quickly, professionals, trained, armed. But inside the building, they had found others. 4 women and a teenage boy, family members of the militia. The women had been cooking breakfast. The boy had been sleeping. When the shooting started, they had panicked, screamed, run. And in the chaos, in the fear and adrenaline, someone had opened fire. Deutsch did not know who pulled the trigger, maybe several of them. The women and boy were cut down. When the smoke cleared, they lay dead. The unit had stood there staring at the bodies, realizing what they had done. Captain Henderson had made a decision. "We report this. They will court-martial us all," he had said. "We say there were only militia. We say they resisted. We say it was a clean operation. Everyone understand?" And they had all agreed. Even Deutsch, who had vomited in the corner, had agreed. Because they were scared. Because they were young. Because they wanted to survive the war and go home. So they had buried the truth. Literally. They had carried the bodies of the 3 women and the boy to a nearby field, dug shallow graves, covered them, reported only the militia deaths, and lived with it for 44 years. Deutsch wept as he told the story. "I have prayed for their souls every day," he said. "I have asked God to forgive me, but I know what we did. We murdered them, and we lied about it. And Walter Calhoun, he was the one who kept telling the story, over and over, the same story. Like if he repeated it enough times, it would become true. But it never did." The OSI investigators compiled their report, presented it to the Attorney General. The decision was made. Prosecute. The indictment was filed in federal court in October 1987. United States versus Walter Eugene Calhoun. Charges: conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, obstruction of justice. The arrest was made on a Tuesday morning. Dorothy was at school when it happened. Raymond called her, hysterical. "They arrested Dad! The FBI came to the house and arrested him! What the hell is happening?" Dorothy felt like she might faint. "I will come home. Do you know anything about this?" "Raymond, do you know anything about this?" She could lie. She could pretend. But she had already made her choice. "Yes," she said quietly. "I reported him." Silence. Long, terrible silence. Then Raymond's voice, cold as ice. "You what?" "I found evidence that he was involved in killing civilians during the war. I reported it to the Department of Justice." "You reported my father." "Raymond, you destroyed our family. You know that? You just destroyed our family." He hung up. Dorothy stood in the empty hallway of Greenfield High School, phone in hand, and knew her marriage was over. The trial was a media circus. Every newspaper in Pennsylvania covered it. World War II hero or war criminal. Decorated vet faces murder charges. Old soldier's dark secret. Walter Eugene became a national story. Veterans groups rallied to his defense. The VFW hired expensive lawyers. Protesters stood outside the courthouse with signs. "Honor our heroes. He fought for your freedom." But others held different signs. "Justice for the victims. War crimes have no statute of limitations." Dorothy attended every day of the trial, sat in the back of the courtroom. Raymond refused to speak to her. Filed for divorce. Took Kenny to live with his sister in Cleveland. Told their son that Mommy was sick, that she had done something very bad, that they could not see her anymore. Dorothy sat alone in the courtroom and listened to the testimony. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented the archival documents, the after-action report with its mention of 21 dead, the investigation memos, the suspended inquiry. They called expert witnesses. A military historian testified about OSS protocols and rules of engagement. A forensic anthropologist described the shallow graves discovered in 1985 by French archaeologists working on a construction site near Saint-Rémy. 4 skeletons, 3 adult females, 1 adolescent male. Evidence of gunshot wounds, buried hastily in unmarked graves 50 yards from the schoolhouse. A French magistrate testified via video link. He described how local records showed that 4 people, wives and a son of militia members, had disappeared on September 17, 1943. No official investigation had ever been conducted. The families had been told the Americans killed them during the liberation. For 40 years, that is what everyone believed. Then Harold Deutsch took the stand. He was 56 now, a slight man with thinning hair and nervous hands. He had been 19 in 1943, the youngest member of Detachment Charlie. He sat in the witness box, avoided looking at Walter Eugene, and told his story in a quiet, breaking voice. "We went in at dawn. The captain said it would be quick. In and out. 17 militia, 4 Germans. We had done it before, but this time was different." He paused, swallowing hard. "When we burst through the door, there was gunfire immediately. Patterson and Sullivan went down. We returned fire. It was chaos, smoke, shouting, people running. We killed the militia guards, secured the ground floor. That is when we heard the screaming upstairs." "What kind of screaming?" the prosecutor asked. "Women. High-pitched, terrified. We went up, found them in what used to be the teacher's apartment. 4 women huddled in a corner, and a boy, maybe 14, 15 years old. They were crying, begging in French. I did not speak much French, but I understood they were saying, 'Please do not kill us.'" "What happened next?" Deutsch's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The captain, Henderson, he was trying to figure out what to do. We could not just leave them there. They had seen us. But they were clearly civilians, not armed, just scared. Then one of the women started screaming louder, calling for help. And the boy, he ran, just bolted for the stairs. And his voice broke entirely. Someone shot him. I do not know who. Maybe Marx, maybe Calhoun, maybe me. I honestly do not know. It happened so fast. The boy fell. And then the women were screaming even louder. And someone said, 'Shut them up.' And there was more gunfire and—" He could not continue, sat there weeping. The judge called a recess. When they resumed, the prosecutor asked, "What happened after they were dead?" "We stood there, just stood there, staring at the bodies. I threw up. Henderson was white as a sheet. And then Calhoun said, 'We cannot report this. They will hang us all.' And Henderson agreed. He said we would bury them. Say there were only militia, that it was a clean operation. We all agreed. Even me, God help me. We were scared. We were kids. We just wanted to survive." "And you buried the bodies?" "Yes, in a field nearby. We marked the location in case anyone ever needed to know. But no one ever asked. The war moved on. We moved on. And the lie became the truth." The defense cross-examined him aggressively, tried to break his testimony, suggested he was misremembering, that trauma had distorted his memories, that he was confused about which operation it was. But Deutsch held firm. "I have lived with this for 44 years, he said. "I know exactly what happened. And I know we were wrong." Walter Eugene's lawyer put on a vigorous defense. He called character witnesses, teachers whose lives Walter had touched, veterans who had served with him, community leaders who praised his decades of service. He argued that Walter had been a teenager thrust into impossible circumstances, that he had acted under orders, that combat stress had clouded his judgment, that prosecuting him now, at 60 years old, was cruel and vindictive. "My client is not a monster," the lawyer said in his closing argument. "He is a man who made a terrible mistake in the fog of war, when he was barely more than a child himself. A mistake he has carried for 44 years. He has spent his entire life since then being a good man, a good father, a good grandfather, a good citizen. To destroy him now, for something that happened in the chaos of combat, is not justice. It is revenge." But the prosecutor's closing was devastating. The defense wants you to believe this was a split-second decision made in combat, but the evidence shows otherwise. After the women and boy were killed, Walter Calhoun and his unit had hours to make a choice. They could have reported what happened, could have admitted the mistake, could have allowed the families to know what happened to their loved ones, to give them proper burials. Instead, They made a calculated decision to hide the truth. They dug graves. They falsified reports. And for 44 years, Walter Calhoun has told the same lie, over and over, turning a war crime into a hero story. That is not fog of war. That is deliberate deception. That is obstruction of justice. And that deserves to be punished. The jury deliberated for 3 days, found him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. Walter Eugene Calhoun, 60 years old, Bronze Star recipient, honorary citizen of Greenfield Township, was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at Dorothy as he passed, but she saw his face, blank, empty, the face of a man whose legend had died. Raymond divorced her 6 months later, refused to let her see Kenny. The court granted him full custody. Dorothy's actions had shown severe lack of judgment and prioritization of crusade over family. She lost everything: her husband, her son, her home. She was forced to resign from her teaching position. The school board said her notoriety made her unsuitable for working with children. She moved to a small apartment in Lawrenceville, worked as a waitress, lived alone. The community turned against her. Old friends crossed the street to avoid her. People spat at her in grocery stores. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on her door. She received death threats in the mail, anonymous calls in the middle of the night. "Your father-in-law is a hero, you bitch. You destroyed a good man. You should kill yourself." Dorothy changed her number, moved again, tried to disappear. But the story followed her. The first year was the hardest. She worked double shifts at a diner on Penn Avenue, serving coffee and eggs to steelworkers who sometimes recognized her and left without paying. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Alice, was one of the few people who treated her normally. "I do not care what you did," Alice said. "You show up on time, you work hard. That is all I need to know." But even Alice could not protect her from the customers. One man threw a plate at her, called her a family-destroying bitch. Another left a note with his bill: "I hope you rot in hell for what you did to that old man." The tips were meager. Some people left pennies as an insult. She lived in a studio apartment with a mattress on the floor, a hot plate, and second-hand furniture from Goodwill. No television, she could not afford it. No telephone, she had disconnected it after the death threats. She walked everywhere because her car had been repossessed during the divorce. Pittsburgh winters were brutal. She would walk to work in the dark through snow and ice, wearing a coat that was too thin, boots that leaked. At night, she would lie on her mattress and stare at the ceiling. Think about Kenny. Wonder what he was learning about her. Whether Raymond was poisoning him against her completely. Whether he remembered her at all. He had been so young when they took him, just 4 years old. By now he was 5, 6, 7, growing up without her, believing she was crazy, cruel, sick. She thought about writing to him, but what would she say? "I destroyed our family because I believed it was right?" How could a child understand that? How could anyone understand that? For years she lived in a kind of exile, working menial jobs, living in cheap apartments, seeing her son only in photographs Raymond's sister occasionally sent, out of pity, she supposed. Kenny growing up, 5, 6, 7 years old, not knowing his mother, believing whatever Raymond told him about her. She moved from the diner to a laundromat, folding clothes for minimum wage, then to a grocery store, stocking shelves overnight. Then to a hospital, cleaning rooms on the graveyard shift. Each job paid barely enough to survive. She qualified for food stamps but was too proud to use them at first. Eventually, pride gave way to hunger. She made no friends, formed no relationships, lived in complete isolation. Sometimes she would go days without speaking to another human being except to say thank you or excuse me. The loneliness was crushing. She had never been a particularly social person, but this was different. This was exile, punishment, the price of truth. At night, Dorothy would lie awake and ask herself, was it worth it? Destroying your entire life for a principle? For 3 women and a boy who died 40 years ago in a country you have never seen? People told her she was crazy, self-righteous, cruel, a fanatic who valued strangers over family. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should have stayed silent, let the old man die in peace, preserved her marriage, her relationship with her son. But then she would remember her father's letter. Silence is complicity. And she would remember the documents, the suspended investigation, the buried graves, the decades of lies. And she would think, no, she had done the right thing, even if it cost her everything. She started keeping a journal, writing late at night after her shifts. Not about her daily life, that was too depressing to document, but about the trial, about her father-in-law, about the choice she had made. She wrote, October 3rd, 1989, 2 years since the arrest. I saw a woman with a little boy at the bus stop today. He was about Kenny's age, 6, maybe 7. He was holding her hand, chattering about school. She was smiling down at him with so much love. I had to turn away. I could not breathe. What have I done? What kind of mother chooses principle over her child? People are right to hate me. I hate myself. But then, a few pages later, October 15th, 1989, I dreamed about the boy last night. The 14-year-old from Saint-Remy. He was running down the stairs, terrified, and then the gunshot. I woke up crying. He had a mother, too. She never knew what happened to him, never knew where he was buried. For 40 years, she wondered. Maybe she blamed herself. Maybe she thought he ran away. Maybe she died not knowing. At least Marie Dubois got answers. At least she knows now. That matters. That has to matter. Walter Eugene died in prison in 1992, 5 years into his sentence. Heart attack. He was 65. Raymond sent Dorothy a brief letter. Dad died. Funeral is Thursday. Do not come. She did not. She stayed home, alone in her apartment, and cried. Not for Walter Eugene. She had long since stopped feeling anything but cold certainty about him. But for Raymond, for Kenny, for the family that had been destroyed. Years passed. Dorothy worked, survived, endured. She had no friends, no social life, just work and solitude. Sometimes she went to the library and read. History books mostly. About the war, about trials, about justice. In 1995, she received an unexpected letter from France, from a woman named Marie Dubois living in Saint-Remy. The letter was in French. Dorothy had to get it translated. Dear Mrs. Brennan, I am writing to you because I recently learned through a newspaper article about the trial of Walter Calhoun. I am the daughter of Anne-Marie Dubois, one of the women killed in the schoolhouse in September 1943. I was 3 years old when my mother died. I grew up never knowing what happened to her. The militia told us she had been killed by the Americans during the liberation. We accepted it. It was war, these things happened. But I always wondered, why was she in that building? Why was there no investigation, no record? Now I know. She was murdered, and the truth was hidden for 50 years, until you uncovered it. I want to thank you. You gave my mother justice. You gave our family truth. I know it cost you dearly. The article mentioned your divorce, your isolation. I want you to know, you did a brave thing, a good thing. You are a hero. Not Walter Calhoun, you. With deepest gratitude, Marie Dubois. Dorothy read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down on her couch and wept. For the first time in 8 years, she felt something other than numbness. Validation. Purpose. proof that she had not been crazy, that it had mattered. In 2000, Kenny turned 17. He was about to graduate high school. Raymond had told him nothing about his mother except that she was sick and not to be contacted. But Kenny was curious, rebellious. He searched online, found newspaper articles about the trial, about his grandfather, read everything. And then, without telling his father, he got on a Greyhound bus to Pittsburgh, found Dorothy's address, knocked on her door. When she opened it and saw him, tall, with Raymond's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, she almost collapsed. "Kenny?" "Hi, Mom." They stared at each other. She was 39, worn down by years of hardship. He was 17, angry and confused. "Can I come in?" Of course. Of course." They sat in her tiny living room, drank coffee, did not speak for a long time. Dorothy could not stop staring at him. This was her son, her baby. The last time she had held him, he had been 4 years old. Now he was nearly a man, taller than her, his voice deep, his face Raymond's face, but younger, softer. She wanted to touch him, to hug him, to never let go. But she sat frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible moment. Finally, Kenny said, "Dad told me you were crazy, that you destroyed the family for no reason. But I read about the trial, about what Grandpa did. Kenny, did you know? Before you reported him?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes. Why?" Dorothy looked at her son. This boy she had carried for 9 months, nursed, loved, lost. "Because it was the right thing to do. Even though it cost you everything? Even though it cost me everything." Kenny was silent. Then he said, "Dad says Grandpa was a war hero, that what happened was an accident, that you are a self-righteous bitch who cares more about strangers than family. Do you believe that?" Kenny looked away. "I do not know what to believe." "That is fair, but I wanted to see you, to hear your side." "My side is simple. 3 women and a 14-year-old boy were killed. Your grandfather was part of it. He lied about it for 50 years. I found evidence. I reported it. He was tried and convicted. That is the truth." "But he was old. He had lived a good life. He was sick. Could you not have just let him die in peace?" "Could you?" Dorothy asked quietly. "If you found out someone you loved had killed innocent people and lied about it, could you stay silent?" Kenny did not answer for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know. Maybe. If it was someone I loved. If staying silent meant keeping my family together." "Then you are a better person than I am," Dorothy said. "Or maybe just a more practical one. You really think you did the right thing?" "Yes. No. I do not know." Dorothy's voice broke. "I think I did what I had to do, what my conscience demanded. But I do not know if it was right. I have lost 13 years with you, Kenny. 13 years. You were 4. Now you are 17. I have missed your whole childhood, your first day of school, your first bike ride, your first everything. I do not know what your favorite food is. I do not know what you like to read. I do not know if you play sports or music or what you want to be when you grow up. I do not know you. And that is—" She could not continue, sat there crying. Kenny sat rigid, uncomfortable. Then, slowly, he moved closer, put his hand on her shoulder. "I like history," he said quietly. "I want to study it in college. Maybe become a professor like Grandpa Gregory. I play basketball, but I am not very good. I like science fiction, Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein. My favorite food is lasagna. And I think what you did was brave, Maybe stupid, maybe cruel, but brave. Dorothy looked up at him through her tears. You really think that? I think you made an impossible choice, and you chose truth over happiness. Most people would not do that. Most people would choose their family, their comfort. But you chose something harder, something that cost you everything. And I do not know if I could do that. But I think it matters that someone did. They talked for 3 hours. Kenny asked questions. Dorothy answered honestly, told him about the nightmares, the documents, the investigation, told him about losing Raymond, losing her job, losing him. Told him about the letter from Marie Dubois. When he left, he hugged her. Just briefly. I am glad I came, he said. Can I come back? Any time, Dorothy whispered. Any time. Over the next year, Kenny visited regularly. At first once a month, taking the Greyhound from Cleveland on weekends. Then more frequently. They were rebuilding something that had been destroyed 13 years earlier. It was slow, tentative, awkward. But it was real. Dorothy learned about her son's life. He was a good student, loved reading, spent hours in the library. He was quiet, serious, did not have many friends. Raymond had raised him strictly. Military discipline, early bedtimes, rigid rules. Kenny had never been to a school dance, never gone to a party, never had a girlfriend. Dad says that stuff is a distraction, Kenny explained. That I need to focus on getting into a good college, getting a good job, being successful. What do you want? Dorothy asked. I do not know. Nobody has ever asked me that before. They started meeting in coffee shops instead of Dorothy's apartment. Neutral territory where they could talk without the weight of her poverty pressing down on them. She would save her tips all month to buy him lunch. He never mentioned that the $20 she insisted on giving him for the bus was probably more than she could afford. He told her about school, about the history class where they had studied World War II, and he had had to sit there while the teacher praised the greatest generation and talked about the heroes of the OSS. I wanted to stand up and scream, Kenny said. I wanted to tell them that my grandfather was one of those heroes, and he murdered civilians and lied about it. But I did not. I just sat there. I am sorry, Dorothy said. I am sorry you have to carry this. It is not your fault. Or, it is your fault. But it is also Grandpa's fault. And I do not know how to feel about any of it. That is okay. You do not have to know. He told her about his relationship with Raymond, how it had deteriorated after Kenny started visiting Dorothy, how Raymond had discovered the visits when Kenny's aunt mentioned seeing him get on a Pittsburgh-bound bus. He was furious, Kenny said, told me I was betraying him, betraying Grandpa's memory, that I was choosing you over family. What did you say? I said she is my mother. That is family too. Dorothy started crying. Kenny looked uncomfortable but did not move away. Raymond found out about the visits, was furious, demanded Kenny stop seeing that woman. Kenny refused. She is my mother, and I think she did the right thing. She destroyed our family. Grandpa destroyed our family. By lying. Mom just told the truth. Raymond stopped speaking to Kenny. Father and son became estranged. Kenny moved to Pittsburgh in the fall of 2000, started at the University of Pittsburgh. Dorothy helped him move into the dorms. It was the first time she had been on a college campus since her own graduate school days. The parents dropping off freshmen all looked so prosperous, so confident. They had SUVs loaded with new computers, mini fridges, expensive bedding. Dorothy had helped Kenny carry his belongings in 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box. But she was there. That was what mattered. Kenny struggled his first semester. He was used to Raymond's rigid structure. College freedom overwhelmed him. He skipped classes, did not turn in assignments, nearly failed out. He called Dorothy, panicking. I cannot do this. I am not smart enough. I'm going to have to drop out." "You are smart enough," Dorothy said firmly. "You are just scared. And that is okay. But you cannot run from this." "What if I fail?" "Then you fail, and you get up and try again. That is what life is, Kenny. Falling down and getting back up." He did not drop out. Turned things around second semester, found his rhythm, discovered he loved research, archives, primary sources. By sophomore year, he had declared a history major and was getting straight A's. She helped him with tuition by working 2 jobs. They were poor, but happy. In 2005, Kenny graduated with honors, decided to pursue a PhD in history. His dissertation topic, Ordinary Men, War Crimes and Memory in the American Experience. It focused on his grandfather's case. Dorothy attended his dissertation defense, watched her son present his research, meticulous, fair, devastating. The dissertation was over 300 pages. It examined not just Walter Eugene's case, but the broader pattern of war crimes committed by American forces and subsequently covered up. It drew on newly declassified documents, interviews with veterans, analysis of official reports versus eyewitness testimony. The chapter on Saint-Remy was particularly powerful. Kenny had traveled to France on a research grant, visited the village, interviewed elderly residents who remembered the liberation. One woman, 93 years old, had been a teenager in 1943. She remembered seeing the American soldiers carry bodies from the schoolhouse. "We all knew there were civilians killed," she told Kenny, "but we were told not to speak of it. The Americans were our liberators. We did not want to seem ungrateful." Kenny's dissertation did not paint his grandfather as a monster. That was what made it so effective. He presented Walter Eugene as an ordinary person, a scared teenager thrown into an extraordinary situation, who made terrible choices and then spent 50 years lying about them. The analysis was clinical, historical, but the pain underneath was obvious to anyone who knew Kenny's connection to the subject. The committee praised it. One professor said, "This is important work. It challenges our comfortable narratives about the greatest generation. It forces us to confront the fact that heroism and atrocity can exist in the same person, that ordinary people can commit extraordinary crimes, and that truth matters, even when it is painful." Another professor, a Vietnam veteran, spoke more quietly. "I served in Vietnam. I saw things, did things, and when I came home, I did not talk about it. None of us did. We told the sanitized version, the heroic version, because that is what people wanted to hear." Your grandson has done what very few scholars have the courage to do. He has punctured that myth. He has shown that war is messy and moral, and that the line between hero and war criminal is thinner than we want to believe. Kenny's dissertation was published as a book in 2008. The Grandfather I Never Knew, A Family History of War, Lies, and Justice. It became required reading in many university courses on war crimes and historical memory. The book received mixed reviews. Academic journals praised it. The American Historical Review called it a searing examination of memory, mythology, and moral responsibility. The Journal of Military History said it was essential reading for anyone interested in the ethics of warfare and the construction of collective memory. But popular response was divided. Some readers found it courageous. Others found it unforgivable. One reviewer on Amazon wrote, "This man destroyed his own grandfather's reputation for a book deal. Shameful." Another wrote, "Finally, someone willing to tell the truth about the greatest generation." Not all of them were heroes. Some were war criminals. We need to stop whitewashing history. Veterans groups condemned it. The VFW issued a statement. This book does a disservice to the millions of brave men and women who served honorably in World War II. To focus on isolated incidents and use them to tarnish an entire generation is historically irresponsible. But other veterans wrote to Kenny. One letter from an 82-year-old man who had served in the Pacific said, "Thank you for writing this. I have carried my own secrets for 60 years. Things I did that I am not proud of. Things we all did and never talked about. Your book made me feel less alone. Kenny became a professor himself, got married, had a daughter, named Dorothy after her grandmother. Young Dorothy was born in 2010. Dorothy Sr. held her great-granddaughter and cried. "I never thought I would live to see this," she whispered. "You did good, Mom," Kenny said. "You did real good." In 2015, the French government awarded Dorothy the Légion d'honneur, France's highest civilian decoration, for extraordinary courage in pursuit of justice for victims of war crimes. The ceremony was held at the French consulate in New York. Dorothy, now 54, stood in a borrowed dress as the consul pinned the medal to her chest. Marie Dubois attended. They met for the first time. Two women, one American, one French, bound by a terrible history. They embraced, wept together. "Thank you," Marie said in accented English. "Thank you for giving us truth." "Thank you for forgiving me," Dorothy replied. "For what?" "For destroying the myth, for making it ugly in public, for—" "No," Marie interrupted firmly. "You did not destroy anything. You revealed. There is a difference. The myth was already a lie. You just showed everyone." That night, Dorothy sat in her hotel room, the medal in her hands. Thought about the cost. Raymond, dead of a heart attack in 2012, never having reconciled with her or Kenny. Years of poverty and isolation. The death threats, the hatred, the exile. But also, Kenny, little Dorothy, Marie Dubois. The truth. Was it worth it? She still did not know. Maybe she would never know. But she had made her choice, and she had lived with it. And in the end, that was all anyone could do. By 2020, Dorothy was 59, living in a small house in Pittsburgh that Kenny had helped her buy. Retired from waitressing, living on Social Security and a modest pension. The COVID pandemic hit. Lockdowns. Isolation. She spent months alone, watching the news, thinking about life. The pandemic brought a strange kind of clarity. Everyone was isolated now. Everyone was alone. Dorothy, who had been alone for 30 years, suddenly found herself in a world where everyone understood what isolation felt like. Where everyone was cut off from the people they loved. Where everyone was learning that connection matters more than they had realized. She watched the news coverage of overwhelmed hospitals, exhausted healthcare workers, people dying alone without their families. And she thought about the women in Saint-Rémy, 3 women who had died afraid and alone, whose bodies had been buried in unmarked graves, whose families had never known the truth. For 77 years, no one had spoken for them. Until she did. She watched the protests after George Floyd's death, people marching in the streets demanding justice, demanding truth, demanding that the powerful be held accountable. And she thought, this is what I did. I demanded accountability. I demanded truth. At a time when no one wanted to hear it, I insisted that lies matter, that covering up crimes matters, that justice matters, even when it is inconvenient. She read articles about Confederate monuments being taken down, about universities renaming buildings that honored slaveholders, about the ongoing reckoning with America's complicated history. And she felt a kind of vindication. The culture was changing. People were finally willing to admit that heroes could also be villains, that the past was more complicated than the myths, that truth mattered more than comfortable lies. But she also watched people refuse to wear masks, refuse to get vaccinated, insist that their personal freedom mattered more than protecting others. And she thought, nothing changes. People still choose comfort over responsibility, still choose their own interests over the common good, still refuse to accept uncomfortable truths. Kenny called regularly. "How are you holding up, Mom?" "Fine. Reading a lot." "What are you reading?" "Memoirs." She did not say whose, but he understood. Mom, do not torture yourself. I am not torturing myself. I am just thinking. About what? About whether it was worth it. Long pause. Then Kenny said, "It was worth it. You did the right thing." How do you know? Because if you had stayed silent, I would never have known the truth. I would have grown up thinking my grandfather was a hero. I would have told my daughter fairy tales about his exploits, and the lie would have lived on. Instead, I know the truth, and I can draw my own conclusions, and I can teach my daughter to distinguish right from wrong. And that matters. Dorothy started crying, quietly, soundlessly. Thank you, son. Thank you, Mom, for having the courage. She thought about writing down her story, not as history, Kenny had done that, but as testimony, as witness, as a record of what it cost to tell the truth, what it took to stand up when everyone wanted you to sit down, what happened when you chose principle over peace. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. War again. People dying, cities destroyed. Dorothy watched the news and thought, we have learned nothing. 80 years since that war, and we are repeating the same mistakes. Killing, betraying, lying. And again, there will be people who say, I was just following orders. I just wanted to survive. I am not guilty. And again, there will be those who choose truth and pay a terrible price for it. She called Kenny. I have been thinking about writing a memoir. About the case? About everything. About Dad. About Walter Eugene. About the choice I made. About the cost. I think you should. You do? Yes, because your story matters. Not just as history, but as a lesson. About courage. About integrity. About what it means to choose truth over comfort. Dorothy started writing. Slowly, painfully. It took her 2 years. The memoir was published in 2024. The Price of Truth, a daughter-in-law's testimony. It was reviewed in major newspapers. Some praised it. Some condemned it. Veterans groups protested. Said she was dishonoring the memory of the greatest generation. Said she was a traitor. But others, historians, ethicists, younger readers, called it essential. Called it brave. Called it necessary. One review in the New York Times said, Dorothy Brennan's memoir is a devastating exploration of moral courage. It asks, what do we owe to truth? What do we owe to family? And what do we do when those two obligations conflict? Brennan's answer is clear and costly. We owe truth everything, even when it destroys us. In spring 2025, Dorothy was 64. She sat in Shenley Park on a bench. Early spring, warm, magnolias blooming, smell of fresh earth and hope. Nearby, children played, laughed, ran. Ordinary, peaceful life. A man approached her, about 40 with graying hair. Excuse me, are you Dorothy Brennan? Yes. I am Michael Harper, grandson of Anne-Marie Dubois, the woman who was killed in Saint-Remy. Dorothy froze. Your grandmother? She died 3 years ago. She was 98. Before she died, she asked me to find you, to thank you. She said, that woman did what needed to be done. She restored justice. Tell her I am grateful for all these years. Dorothy sat silently. Tears streamed down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Michael nodded. I also thank you. Because of you, my grandmother lived her last years knowing the truth, knowing that the man responsible was punished. It mattered to her. She could sleep peacefully. He extended his hand. Dorothy stood, shook it. They stood like that for a moment. Two strangers bound by a terrible story. Then Michael left. Dorothy sat back down on the bench, looked at the blooming magnolias, the playing children, the peaceful sky, and thought, maybe I really did do the right thing. Maybe truth really is more important than comfort, more important than family harmony, more important than personal happiness. Because truth is memory, and memory is what makes us human. She stood, walked home, slowly, leaning on a cane. Her knees were not what they used to be. But she walked straight, head held high. She had lived a difficult life, made a difficult choice, paid a high price, but she had walked this path to the end, and she had not turned back. At home, Kenny was waiting. Brought a new book, fresh from the printer. "Mom, look!" Dorothy took the book in her hands. Hardcover, beautiful design. Title: Memory and Justice, The Story of One Family. Author: Kenneth Raymond Calhoun. She opened the first page. Dedication: To my mother, Dorothy Brennan, the woman who chose truth. And then, this book is dedicated to everyone who has ever faced a choice, to speak or stay silent, to reveal or conceal, to remember or forget. This is a book about the fact that truth always costs, but silence costs more. Dorothy read and cried. Kenny sat beside her, arm around her shoulders. "You did good, Mom," he said quietly. "You did the right thing, and I am proud of you." She pressed against her son, this wise, kind man she had raised alone, who became a historian, who seeks truth, who remembers. "I am proud of you too, son," she whispered. "You grew up to be a good person." They sat like that for a long time, mother and son. Two lives bound by one terrible story. A story about how grandfather's tales turned out to be lies. How truth turned out to be more terrible than any fiction. How one choice changed the fate of 3 generations. And outside, magnolias bloomed, children played, the sun shone, life continued, despite everything. Epilogue, 38 years later. Spring 2025, Pittsburgh. Dorothy Grace Brennan, 64 years old, sits in her small house in Lawrenceville, at the window, looking at the city, at the magnolias that have bloomed again despite everything. Beside her, son Kenny, 42-year-old historian, and granddaughter Dorothy, 15-year-old girl with serious eyes. They drink coffee, are silent. Outside, life. People walk the streets. Children laugh. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of construction, the city rebuilding, always rebuilding. But here, in this room, peace. "Grandma," young Dorothy says, "do you regret it?" Dorothy is silent for a long time. Then she shakes her head. "No, I do not regret it. I did what I had to do." "Even though it cost you everything?" "Even though it cost me everything." Young Dorothy nods. She understands, because she is the 4th generation, the generation that knows the truth, that remembers, that will not forget. "I would do the same," she says quietly. "If I had to choose between truth and comfort, I would choose truth." Dorothy looks at her, at this girl who resembles her so much at that age, and smiles, sadly, wisely. "I know, sweetheart, I know." And outside, magnolias bloom, and life continues, and memory lives, and truth does not die. Never.